Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Monday, October 7th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, the latest on a new storm brewing in the Gulf, plus concerns over postal delays in this year's election. And red states are getting redder, while blue states are getting bluer. What does that mean for our politics? There's a new hurricane on the way, Milton. The storm gained hurricane status yesterday as it rolled through the Gulf of Mexico on a track headed Wednesday for parts of the Florida Peninsula still reeling from Hurricane Helene. The National Hurricane Center predicts the storm will reach major hurricane status later today, meaning at least a Category 3. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis yesterday expanded a state of emergency that now covers 51 of the state's 67 counties. Today marks 1 year since Hamas attacked civilians in Israel, and Israeli defense forces responded with bombings and eventually a ground invasion in Gaza. The Gaza War has spread across the Middle East and put Israel on the brink of war with Iran. The brutal invasion swept into Israel and caught military defenses by surprise a year ago. Hamas gunmen attacked army bases, civilian communities, and an all-night music festival about 3 miles from the Gaza border a year ago today. Israel retaliated the next day. They've waged ensuing battles against Hamas in Gaza, then Hamas allies, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iranian forces in Iran. Hamas in its attacks on Israel a year ago killed some 1,200 people and took about 250 hostages, according to Israeli figures. Gaza's health ministry says Israel's Gaza offensive has killed almost 42,000 Palestinians. For Shlomi Berger, whose 20-year-old daughter Agam was taken hostage, it has been a year of agony. For Nor Swierke, who was evacuated 4 different times and whose children are now living in Cairo, it has also been a year of agony. You can find a special edition episode of The Excerpt right here on this feed that aired yesterday to hear their stories. We have a link in today's show notes. Election officials and lawmakers are worried that U.S. Postal Service delays could prevent thousands of ballots from being counted this year in what could be a close election next month. I spoke with USA Today Justice Department correspondent Bart Jansen to learn more. Bart, thanks for hopping on.
Thanks for having me.
So, Bart, what are these concerns some state election officials have about postal delays during this election? And, do the numbers about post office delays really back up those concerns?
It's a pretty serious concern put forward mostly by the National Association of Secretaries of State. Those are the state-level officials that basically govern elections, and also the National Association of Directors of Elections. Those folks have written a couple of letters to Postmaster General Louis DeJoy to say there are these problems such as ballots arriving late, that first-class ballots are supposed to arrive within 3 to 5 business days, and they say dozens, hundreds in some locations arrived longer than 10 days after primary elections this year. The concern is that if they show up late, then they get discarded and folks are going to lose their votes. So they've met with DeJoy a couple of times and they're trying to encourage him to just make sure that the Postal Service does the best job that it can. Now, DeJoy has responded that, the Postal Service understands the importance of ballots in both directions, getting mailed out from the government officials and then getting mailed back so that they can be counted. They strive for punctuality. He said that 99% plus get delivered within 7 days. So they're not meeting their own first-class goal, but they are getting there within a week of business days. He says they go to heroic efforts to try to get those ballots delivered, but state election officials remain concerned, and with the election only about 30 days away, they want to make sure that everything is in place to do the best job that they can this time around.
Bart, can you help us understand really just how popular mail-in voting has gotten in recent elections, especially since 2020? And are there any partisan leans in terms of who actually mails in a ballot?
Yeah, the number of people using absentee ballots has grown dramatically, largely in the 2020 election because of the coronavirus pandemic at that time, where the share of people casting absentee ballots was somewhere around 24% in 2016, but that it jumped up to 43% in 2020. So it's just an enormous jump. Something like 60% of Democratic voters use absentee ballots, but the number is about half that of Republicans casting ballots that way. So there's a bit of friction. There have been some Republican lawsuits that want to make sure that ballots are cast correctly. They've alleged that the ballots maybe that aren't signed or dated, that they've got to be discarded. There's actually a pending lawsuit that was just argued in the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, where the Republican National Committee is asking that no absentee ballots be counted if they arrive after Election Day, even though the state of Mississippi has a 5-day grace period for ballots to arrive after Election Day. Now, their argument is the ballot was cast, so long as it's postmarked by Election Day, the person voted, but it just isn't counted until perhaps 5 days afterward. But the RNC says they don't want any ballots arriving that late. And so we're waiting on an appeals decision. And that's a case where legal experts say that actually go to the Supreme Court this year. So there's a lot of interest in absentee ballots, and it's because they're becoming so much more popular.
And Bart, for folks listening thinking, hey, I'm planning on mailing in a ballot here over the next few weeks. What advice do election officials give folks who do plan on voting by mail this year?
Yeah, I think the message is the same from lawmakers who have voiced concerns about these problems to the election officials who are administering the elections to the Postal Service itself, Mr. DeJoy, all saying that the safest thing to do would be to mail a mailed-in ballot at least 7 days before the election. One Secretary of State was telling me their advice has been, if it gets to be Halloween, you really want to check that your ballot has gotten in, because you might have to look for a different course of action. People are really gotten used to the idea that you could, one person said, vote from your couch, vote from the kitchen table. But you want to make sure that that ballot actually arrived. And so the way to do that is to send it in early.
All right. Bart Jansen covers the Justice Department for USA Today. Thank you, Bart.
Thanks for having me.
President Joe Biden's administration continued to push back yesterday against former President Donald Trump's unfounded claims about Hurricane Helene's storm recovery. Appearing on ABC's This Week yesterday, Federal Emergency Management Agency Administrator Deanne Criswell said her agency has all the resources it needs to respond to Helene, which ravaged parts of Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and other states. North Carolina and Georgia are key swing states in next month's election, which has heightened the political stakes for the recovery effort. Criswell defended FEMA's response and shot down Trump's claims that the agency is short on disaster relief funds because money has been diverted to help undocumented immigrants, and that help is being withheld from Republican areas, calling such assertions frankly ridiculous and just plain false. Trump has made a series of unfounded claims about Helene recovery at multiple events in recent days. He said at a rally in Michigan Thursday that, quote, Kamala spent all her FEMA money, billions of dollars, on housing for illegal immigrants, unquote. You can read more with a link in today's show notes. A USA Today analysis shows most counties have become more partisan, leaving less room for compromise. I spoke with USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page for more. Susan, I thank you for hopping on today.
It's my pleasure.
So, Susan, what did this exclusive USA Today analysis find really about how partisan leanings have intensified in recent years?
We looked at trends by county, all more than 3,000 counties in the United States, and what's happened from 2012 to 2016 to 2020. And what we found was in 3/4 of the counties, the red counties have gotten redder and the blue counties have gotten bluer. And if you want an explanation of why our politics have gotten hotter, there's one of them.
Yeah, so we also had some specific polling data here. What did this USA Today Suffolk University poll find really about, how important it is to Americans that they live in a community, Susan, that shares their general political views? And how did that compare to those who said it's important they live in a community with diverse political views?
It's pretty clear Americans feel pushed and pulled in two directions on this issue, because a majority of Americans, 55%, told us it's important to them to live in a community with people who have political views much like their own. But even more Americans, 60%, said it was important to them to live in a community with diverse points of view. So we seem to be holding both these things as virtues at the same time. Some people feel both ways, think both things are important. And of course, some people think one or the other is more important. There is a partisan divide on this. Republicans are much more likely to say living in a community with people of similar views is important to me. Democrats are much more likely to say it's important to me to live in a place with diverse views.
And Susan, as you write in the piece, there's this kind of chicken and egg idea to this, where some Americans say, redder policies or bluer policies in their states have actually pushed them to move elsewhere. Can you talk through this idea?
We see really a patchwork of laws across the country on things like abortion or transgender care. And one reason we see that is because in most states, in 40 of the 50 states, one party or the other controls all of the state government, the governorship and the state legislature. And that enables them to pass policies that seem either very conservative or very liberal, even when they're states next door to one another. You think of a state like Colorado next to a state like Wyoming, and they have very different attitudes on some of these big issues. And why is that? It's because we've seen Colorado be a very attractive place for some Democrats, and we've seen Wyoming be a draw to some Republicans and conservatives. And so that sorting then it's like a chicken and an egg aspect to the enactment of these policies. They're the result of people sorting into states, but they also lead to people sorting into states.
So, Susan, really, what are the implications of these redder red states and bluer blue states? What does this functionally mean for next month's election and also just elections going forward?
The sorting of states into being very red or very blue means that most states are irrelevant to the election we're going to have in November. We know that there are only 7 battleground states that everybody's focused on. That's because we pretty much know where the other states are going to go in this election.
And Susan, in terms of the impact really beyond elections, what can you tell us here? I know you wrote about some of the other aspects of this.
Social scientists have looked at the effect of living in communities, mostly with people who are like you by race or by religion. It reduces the opportunity to get to know people who are different. It reduces the opportunity for conversations. It also reduces the need for compromise.
Susan Page is USA Today's Washington Bureau Chief with some great insight for us, as always. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.